There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in a patent office. It is the year 1905 in the Swiss city of Bern, and a young clerk is sitting at a desk, supposedly evaluating other people's inventions, but his mind is somewhere else entirely. He is chasing a beam of light. He wants to know what would happen if he could run alongside it, fast enough to look it in the eye. That question, the kind of question most adults are taught to stop asking somewhere around the age of 10, is about to break physics into pieces and rebuild it from scratch. His name is Albert Einstein, and within 12 months he will publish 4 papers that will quietly end one version of the universe and begin another. No telescopes, no laboratory funded by a government, just a notebook, a pencil, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the universe owed him simple answers. Now fast forward. More than a century later, in bedrooms, offices, and server farms around the world, machines are writing poetry, diagnosing diseases, generating images of faces that have never existed, and in some cases, making decisions that not even their own creators can fully explain. Artificial intelligence has stopped being a subplot in science fiction and has become the operating system of modern civilization. And so a question arises that is impossible to resist. What would Einstein, the man who reshaped how humanity understands space, time, and reality itself, think about this? Would he be fascinated? Would he be terrified? Would he recognize in today's algorithms an echo of the very forces he spent his life trying to understand? Or would he see something else entirely, a threat not to physics, but to something far more fragile, the human mind's ability to imagine? This is not a video that pretends Einstein is speaking from beyond the grave. He left no notes on neural networks. He never used the term machine learning. What this video will do is something different and in some ways more interesting. It will take the documented architecture of his thinking, his philosophy of science, his deep suspicion of authority, his complicated relationship with technology, his writings on creativity, ethics, and human nature, and use them as a lens to ask not what Einstein said, but what kind of mind he had, and what that kind of mind would likely make of a world where machines can think. By the end of this hour, you will understand something most people get wrong about Einstein, that his greatest fear was never a specific machine. It was something quieter and arguably already happening. Stay with this story. The answer is not what you expect. Before this exploration goes any further, it deserves a foundation, because most people know Einstein as a face. The wild hair, the tongue sticking out in that famous photograph, the man on posters next to the word genius. But the actual human being behind that image was sharper, stranger, and more politically engaged than the cartoon version most of us inherited. Einstein was born in 1879 in Germany into a Jewish family that was not particularly religious, but deeply shaped by the intellectual currents of 19th century Europe. As a child, he was slow to speak, and some of his teachers considered him unremarkable, even difficult. This detail matters, not as a feel-good fact for underachievers, but because it reveals something true about how Einstein's mind worked. He was never built to please an institution. He was built to question one. His most famous contribution, the theory of relativity, did not come from a giant laboratory. It came from thought experiments, imagining what it would feel like to fall in an elevator with no windows, imagining 2 flashes of lightning, and asking whether 2 observers, moving differently through space, would even agree on which flash happened first. This is the core of Einstein's genius that most documentaries skip past too quickly. He didn't outcalculate his peers. He out-imagined them. He treated imagination as a rigorous tool, not a decorative one. He once described imagination as more important than knowledge, because knowledge is limited to what we currently understand, while imagination can reach toward what we don't yet understand. This is documented, written, real, and it is the single most important key for everything this video will explore later. Because artificial intelligence, at its core, is a technology built almost entirely on existing knowledge. It is trained on the past. Einstein's entire career was a rebellion against the idea that the past defines the limits of the possible. There's another piece of Einstein's personality that rarely makes it into the simplified textbook version: his complicated relationship with authority and centralized power. He distrusted nationalism. He distrusted blind obedience to institutions. He famously left a school in Germany partly because of its rigid, militaristic teaching style, a system that valued memorization and discipline over curiosity and independent thought. This wasn't a minor footnote. It shaped how he saw the difference between education that produces obedient calculators and education that produces independent thinkers. Keep that distinction in mind. Obedient calculators versus independent thinkers. We will return to it because it sits at the exact center of the modern AI debate, whether anyone realizes it or not. And then there's the side of Einstein that surprises most people: his political activism. After the development of the atomic bomb, a weapon whose theoretical foundation rested partly on his own equation, E equals mc squared, Einstein spent much of his later life warning the world about the dangers of unchecked scientific power falling into the wrong hands. He co-signed letters, he gave warnings, he expressed public regret about his indirect role in nuclear weapons development. This is historically documented. He once said that if he had known the Germans would not succeed in developing the atomic bomb, he never would have lifted a finger toward that letter that helped initiate the American program. So before this video goes any further into speculation, here is the historical foundation, stated plainly. Einstein was a man who valued imagination over rote knowledge, who distrusted centralized and unaccountable power, who feared the misuse of scientific breakthroughs by people who did not understand their consequences, and who believed deeply that science divorced from ethics was a dangerous half-finished tool. Now hold all of that in your mind, because we are about to drop it directly into the middle of 2026, in a world where a chatbot can write a love letter, diagnose a tumor, and generate a deepfake video all before lunch. Let's start with a question in the title, the one that probably brought you here. Would Einstein have hated artificial intelligence? The honest answer, the one that respects both history and intellectual integrity, is almost certainly not in the simple way that question implies. Einstein was not a technophobe. This is one of the biggest misconceptions to clear up immediately. He was, after all, a physicist whose own work made modern electronics, GPS satellites, and semiconductor technology theoretically possible. The same relativistic equations he developed are literally used today to correct the clocks on satellites that make your phone's map app function. Without his physics, modern technology, including the hardware running today's AI systems, would not work as precisely as it does. So this isn't a story about an old-world genius recoiling from shiny new gadgets. Einstein admired engineering. He admired clever solutions to hard problems. What this video will argue, based on his documented values, is something more specific and more interesting. Einstein's relationship with AI would likely not be about the machine itself, but about three deeper questions he asked about every powerful tool humanity ever built. Who controls it? What does it do to human imagination? And does it serve humanity? Or does humanity start serving it? Let's take these one at a time, because each one opens a door to a different room in this investigation, and each room is more unsettling than the last. First, who controls it? Einstein lived through one of the most dramatic case studies in history about technology escaping the intentions of its creators. Nuclear fission was, at first, a beautiful theoretical puzzle, pure physics. The kind of thing Einstein loved, elegant, mathematical, almost philosophical. And then it became a weapon capable of erasing cities in seconds. Einstein did not build the bomb himself. That historical detail gets blurred constantly in pop culture. He signed a letter warning the U.S. government about the danger of the Nazis acquiring such a weapon first. But the actual bomb was developed by other scientists in a massive secret program he had only peripheral connection to. Still, the experience marked him for the rest of his life. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein spent years advocating for international control of nuclear technology, for transparency, for cooperation between nations to prevent any single government or group from holding unchecked destructive power. He warned repeatedly and publicly about the dangers of scientific power concentrated without democratic oversight or global accountability. Now look at where artificial intelligence stands today. A small number of companies, mostly based in a handful of countries, control the most powerful AI models on Earth. The computing power required to train cutting-edge systems is so enormous that only a handful of organizations can even attempt it. Governments are scrambling to write regulations after the technology has already been deployed to hundreds of millions of users, not before. Sound familiar? This is not the video claiming Einstein would have said AI is the new atomic bomb. That would be reckless and historically dishonest. But based on the documented pattern of his concerns, the structural parallel is impossible to ignore. A transformative technology, developed rapidly, concentrated in the hands of a small number of actors, with global consequences arriving faster than global governance. If Einstein cared this much about who controlled the power of the atom, it is reasonable, careful speculation, not fact, to imagine he would have asked the same question about who controls the power of cognition itself. And here's where it gets more uncomfortable. With the atomic bomb, the danger was destruction. With artificial intelligence, the danger many experts highlight today is different. Not annihilation, but dependency. Not an explosion, but an erosion, which leads directly into the second door. Second, what does it do to human imagination? Remember that idea from earlier, the one we asked you to hold on to? Imagination over knowledge? This wasn't a throwaway inspirational quote for Einstein. It was load-bearing. His entire scientific method depended on it. Special relativity wasn't discovered by accumulating more facts about light. It was discovered by imagining an impossible scenario, riding alongside a beam of light and asking what that would feel like, then working out the mathematical consequences of taking that imagined scenario seriously. Modern large language models, the technology behind most popular AI chatbots, work in a fundamentally different way. They are trained on enormous datasets of existing human text, books, articles, conversations, websites. They learn statistical patterns of how words follow other words. When you ask one of these systems a question, It is not imagining an impossible scenario, the way Einstein imagined riding alongside light. It is calculating the most statistically probable continuation of your sentence based on everything humans have already written. This is an extremely powerful trick. It can summarize information, draft documents, write code, and even generate ideas that feel surprising to the user. But it is fundamentally a system built on interpolating from the past, not on the kind of radical leap into the unknown that defined Einstein's most important breakthroughs. So here's a genuinely interesting question worth sitting with. Could a system like this have invented relativity in 1905? Almost certainly not, and not because it lacks raw computational power. It's because revolutionary scientific leaps, the kind Einstein specialized in, often require contradicting the existing consensus, the very thing these systems are mathematically designed to reflect back to us. An AI trained on the physics of 1904 would have predicted more of the same incremental adjustments that physicists were already comfortable with. It would not have suggested throwing out the assumption that time is the same for everyone everywhere, because nobody had written that idea down yet for it to learn from. This doesn't mean future, more advanced AI systems can never produce genuinely novel insights, and in fact, some specialized scientific AI systems have already helped discover new antibiotics, new protein structures, even new mathematical proofs that's real, documented, and important. But there's a meaningful difference between a tool that helps explore a vast possibility space faster than humans can, which is happening today, and a tool that asks an entirely new kind of question that nobody has ever conceived of asking, which remains uniquely, stubbornly human, at least so far. This is likely where Einstein's fascination and his deep concern would have split into two separate emotions. Fascination, because faster exploration of solution spaces, AI folding proteins in days instead of years, would have thrilled a man who once compared scientific discovery to detective work, piecing together hidden clues about how the universe operates. Concern, because if humans start outsourcing not just the calculation, but the very act of questioning itself, society risks producing a generation of brilliant calculators and very few independent thinkers. Sound familiar? That's the exact distinction Einstein drew when he criticized the rigid, memorization-based schooling of his own childhood. This brings us to a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people, and it deserves its own moment to land properly. Einstein wrote extensively, across decades, about education, and one consistent theme runs through almost everything he said on the subject. He despised education systems that prioritize memorizing facts over developing the capacity to think independently. He believed that the value of education was not in stuffing a brain with information that could easily be looked up in a book, but in training the mind to reason, question, and create. Now place that belief next to a generation of students today who can ask an AI chatbot to write their essay, solve their math homework, or summarize an entire book in 30 seconds. There are now documented academic studies, real ones, conducted by universities and educational researchers, examining whether heavy reliance on AI tools is correlated with reduced critical thinking performance among students who use them frequently for schoolwork. The findings are still being debated and aren't fully settled science, but the concern itself echoes something Einstein warned about nearly a century earlier, in a completely different context, about an entirely different technology, an education system that produces what he essentially called trained dogs, capable of regurgitating information, but never taught to think for themselves. This is speculation grounded in documented values, not a prediction presented as fact. If Einstein could see how some students today use AI not as a tool to deepen their thinking, but as a replacement for thinking altogether, it is reasonable to imagine this would have triggered one of his strongest and most consistent intellectual objections, a concern he voiced repeatedly throughout his life about a completely different educational crisis in his own era. But, and this is crucial for keeping this analysis honest, the comparison cuts both ways. AI could also be the most powerful tool in history for fostering exactly the kind of independent curiosity Einstein valued. A student with access to an infinitely patient tutor who can explain any concept at any pace, in any style, until it clicks. A curious teenager in a remote village with no access to expert physics teachers can now ask an AI to explain relativity using as many different analogies as it takes for the idea to land. That's not a hypothetical. That's already happening, right now, today, for millions of learners worldwide. So which version wins? The crutch that weakens thinking, or the accelerant that strengthens it? The honest answer, the one Einstein himself probably would have insisted on if he saw this debate, is that it depends entirely on how the tool is used, and that's a profoundly unsatisfying answer for a YouTube video, but a deeply truthful one for real life. Now for the third door, the one that gets less attention in most AI discourse, but that fits Einstein's worldview more tightly than almost anything else. Does it serve humanity, or does humanity start serving it? Einstein wasn't just a physicist. He was, by his own description and by the documented record of his public statements, someone who believed deeply in human dignity, individual freedom, and the danger of systems, political, economic, or technological, that reduce human beings to mere components serving a larger machine. He was famously critical of blind nationalism, comparing it at one point to a kind of disease infecting otherwise rational people. He valued the individual conscience over conformity to any system, however powerful that system claimed to be. Now consider the modern relationship many people have with algorithmic systems, not even the most advanced AI, but something far more mundane, the recommendation algorithms running social media platforms. These systems were trained in a different sense than language models, but conceptually related to maximize a single number, usually engagement or watch time. And in doing so, well documented by researchers, journalists, and even former employees of these companies, they have inadvertently shaped human attention, political polarization, and even mental health outcomes on a massive global scale. Not because any single person designed it to do harm, but because an optimization process pursued its narrow goal with ruthless mathematical efficiency, indifferent to the broader human consequences. This is precisely the kind of scenario that would likely have alarmed someone with Einstein's documented values. Not a single evil mastermind, but a system optimized brilliantly for a narrow goal, producing consequences nobody fully intended or controls, consequences that subtly reshape human behavior on a planetary scale. Replace nuclear chain reaction with engagement optimization feedback loop, and the underlying structural fear, power unleashed faster than humanity's collective wisdom can manage it, becomes eerily familiar. Let's pause here and zoom out, because something important is starting to take shape across this video, and it deserves to be named directly before going further. The most intellectually honest version of what would Einstein think about AI isn't really a question about Einstein predicting specific outcomes. It's a question about applying a specific, documented mode of thinking his mode of thinking, to a problem he never lived to see. And that mode of thinking had a distinct signature: extreme skepticism toward unchecked power, deep reverence for human imagination as something irreplaceable, and a moral conviction that scientific progress without ethical guardrails is dangerous, not despite its brilliance, but because of it. With that signature firmly established through historical evidence, let's now stress test it, because no honest analysis presents only one side. Let's explore where this Einstein-inspired lens might actually be wrong, or at least incomplete. Here's the first major counter-argument, and it's a strong one. Einstein lived and worked entirely within the era of classical and early quantum physics, a world where scientific progress was driven by individual genius, elegant theory, and small teams of collaborators scribbling equations on chalkboards. He had no direct historical experience with information technology, computing, or anything resembling the digital world we live in today. His most famous statements about science, imagination, and education were formed in response to the specific challenges of his era: rigid Prussian schooling, the militarization of physics through nuclear weapons, the political nationalism of 2 world wars. It is entirely possible and intellectually honest to admit that Einstein, if he had lived to see the digital revolution unfold gradually, computers, then the internet, then smartphones, then AI, might have developed completely different intuitions than the ones we're extrapolating from his early 20th century context. Plenty of brilliant scientific minds from his era who did live long enough to witness the dawn of computing, figures like John von Neumann, for example, became enthusiastic, hands-on architects of early computer science, rather than cautious skeptics standing at a safe distance. There is no guarantee Einstein would have followed a different path. Maybe the same curiosity that drove him to imagine riding on a beam of light would have driven him to become one of AI's most excited early adopters rather than one of its most cautious critics. This is an important check on the entire framing of this video, and it's worth stating plainly: we genuinely don't know. Nobody does. Anyone who tells you with total confidence exactly what Einstein would think about ChatGPT is overselling certainty for the sake of a more dramatic headline. Here's the second major tension worth exploring, and it's more philosophically interesting than the first. Throughout his life, Einstein expressed views about science that occasionally seemed to contradict each other, at least on the surface, which is honestly true of almost every complex thinker who lived long enough to evolve their views. Early in his career, he was a fierce advocate for following where the evidence and the mathematics led, regardless of how strange or counterintuitive the conclusions seemed. Special and general relativity were, in their time, deeply strange ideas that violated everyday human intuition about how the universe should work. Yet later in his life, Einstein became famously resistant to certain implications of quantum mechanics, the branch of physics that, ironically, his own early work had helped establish. His objection, often summarized by his famous remark that God does not play dice with the universe, reflected discomfort with quantum theory's inherently probabilistic, non-deterministic nature. Many physicists at the time, and essentially the entire field today, consider Einstein to have simply been wrong about quantum mechanics. The experimental evidence overwhelmingly supports the strange, probabilistic nature of reality at the smallest scales that he resisted philosophically until his death. This matters enormously for our analysis because it reveals something crucial. Einstein, despite being history's most celebrated scientific revolutionary, was also capable of clinging stubbornly to his own intuitions, even when the data pointed elsewhere. So here's the uncomfortable, balanced question this raises. If Einstein could be wrong, dramatically and persistently wrong, about quantum mechanics, a field he helped create, is it possible that a hypothetical Einstein encountering AI today might similarly cling to an outdated intuition, dismissing the genuine capabilities of modern machine learning the same way he once dismissed the probabilistic heart of quantum theory? Maybe his philosophical instincts about imagination and creativity, the ones this video has leaned on throughout, would turn out to be his quantum mechanics blind spot, a brilliant mind defending a position that history ultimately proves incomplete. This is genuinely one of the most fascinating tensions in this entire investigation, and it deserves to be sat with rather than resolved too quickly. We are using Einstein's recorded philosophy to predict his reaction to AI, while simultaneously acknowledging that his philosophy wasn't infallible even within his own field of expertise. Here's a third counterpoint, this one a bit more grounded in plain historical fact rather than philosophical tension. Einstein was not, in fact, a Luddite or anti-technology figure in any simple sense. He held patents. He collaborated with inventor Leo Szilard on a refrigeration technology, a real, documented historical fact that surprises most people who only know him as a theoretical physicist. He was deeply engaged with the practical, mechanical world, not floating above it in pure abstraction. This complicates any narrative that paints him as someone who would have recoiled from a powerful new machine simply because it was a machine. If anything, the historical record suggests Einstein respected clever engineering as a parallel form of human creativity to theoretical physics, just expressed through gears and circuits rather than equations. This actually strengthens, rather than weakens, the most nuanced version of this video's central argument. Einstein's concerns about AI, if they existed, would almost certainly not have been about the technology's cleverness, which he likely would have admired, but about its concentration of power and its potential impact on human imagination and autonomy, the same two concerns that ran through his actual documented public statements about nuclear weapons and authoritarian education. Let's bring this back from counter-arguments into a clearer, more grounded territory. The documented, real-world implications of AI today, viewed honestly through the specific lens we've built throughout this video. Start with science itself, the field Einstein dedicated his life to. Today, AI systems like AlphaFold, developed by Google DeepMind, have solved a problem that stumped biologists for decades, predicting the three-dimensional structure of proteins based on their genetic sequence. This is not speculative future technology. It is real, peer-reviewed, Nobel Prize-winning work. The 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded specifically for this breakthrough. AlphaFold has already predicted the structures of over 200 million proteins, essentially the entire known proteome, accelerating drug discovery and biological research in ways that would have taken human scientists working alone many additional decades to achieve through traditional experimental methods. This is precisely the kind of accelerated discovery that would likely have thrilled Einstein, the side of him that genuinely loved elegant solutions to hard, previously unsolvable problems. He once compared the work of theoretical physics to detective work, gathering scattered clues about how nature operates and assembling them into a coherent picture. AlphaFold does something structurally similar, just at a scale and speed no individual human detective could match. But here's the layer of nuance worth adding immediately, because it's where the deeper concern from earlier resurfaces. AlphaFold didn't ask a new kind of question. It didn't redefine what a protein even is, the way Einstein redefined what time and space even are. It solved, brilliantly and at unprecedented scale, a well-defined problem that human scientists had already identified and framed for it. This distinction between solving known problems faster and conceiving entirely new categories of problems is exactly the line between assistant intelligence and the genuinely revolutionary kind of imagination Einstein specialized in. Today's AI excels overwhelmingly at the former. It remains, at least for now, far weaker at the latter. Now consider a completely different domain: warfare and weapons. The area where Einstein's documented regret and activism were most intense and most public. Today, multiple militaries around the world are developing autonomous weapons systems, drones and other devices capable of identifying and engaging targets with minimal or, in some controversial cases, without direct human approval for each individual strike. This is not science fiction. It is the subject of ongoing, real, contentious debate at the United Nations and among international human rights organizations, with some countries pushing for binding treaties, restricting or banning fully autonomous lethal weapons, and others resisting those restrictions. If there is one area where the parallel to Einstein's nuclear regret feels almost uncomfortably direct, it's this one. Einstein spent the final years of his life warning, publicly and repeatedly, that humanity had developed destructive power faster than it had developed the wisdom, the international cooperation, and the ethical frameworks needed to control it safely. He didn't argue for halting all weapons research. He argued for international oversight, transparency, and accountability that could keep pace with the destructive potential of new technology. Substitute autonomous AI weapons for nuclear weapons. And his most famous public warnings translate almost word for word into the headlines of an actual 2026 newspaper. This is, again, careful and explicit speculation, not a hidden quote. Nobody can pull a direct historical statement from Einstein about autonomous drones because they did not exist in his lifetime. But the structural parallel between his documented nuclear-era warnings and today's AI weapons debate is, at minimum, intellectually striking enough to deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal as mere coincidence. Let's shift now to something a little less dramatic, but arguably even more important for everyday viewers watching this video: work, creativity, and the economy. There is something almost poetic, in an unsettling way, about the fact that some of the first jobs AI has begun automating or significantly augmenting are creative ones: writing, illustration, music composition, even certain aspects of coding, traditionally considered among the most human of all professional activities, the ones requiring imagination, the very quality Einstein prized above raw knowledge. Major creative industries have already experienced real, documented disruption. The 2023 Hollywood writers and actors strikes in the United States included specific formal demands around the use of AI in scriptwriting and digital likeness replication, a real labor dispute that made international headlines and resulted in actual contractual changes governing how studios can use AI tools in film and television production going forward. Illustrators and visual artists have organized lawsuits against AI image generation companies, arguing their copyrighted work was used without consent or compensation to train systems that now compete directly with their own livelihoods. These are not hypothetical future concerns. They are present tense, ongoing legal and economic battles happening right now. Here's where it's worth returning, one more time, to the central philosophical thread of this entire video. If Einstein genuinely believed imagination was humanity's most precious and irreplaceable cognitive asset, more valuable even than accumulated knowledge, then a world where machines can generate passable, creative content faster and cheaper than human artists raises a question that goes well beyond economics. It becomes a question about what specifically remains uniquely, irreducibly human once a machine can convincingly imitate even our most personal, expressive, creative output. And this is precisely where one of the most fascinating modern debates in AI research becomes directly relevant: the difference researchers draw between interpolation and extrapolation. Interpolation means generating new combinations of patterns the system has already seen extensively in its training data, essentially highly sophisticated remixing. Extrapolation means genuinely reasoning beyond the boundaries of existing patterns into entirely new conceptual territory. Current AI systems are, by most expert accounts, extraordinarily good at interpolation and still quite limited at true extrapolation. Special relativity was extrapolation in its purest, most extreme form, a leap so far beyond existing physics that it required discarding assumptions to every other physicist alive in 1905 considered self-evidently true. So, an unsettling but genuinely important question worth sitting with. In a hypothetical future where AI systems eventually master extrapolation as well as interpolation, assuming that's even achievable with current approaches, which remains a serious, unresolved open question among AI researchers themselves, would there be anything left that's uniquely human about scientific or creative genius? Or would Einstein's famous, oft-repeated quote about imagination being more important than knowledge become, ironically and rather sadly, the very obituary for a uniquely human form of intelligence that machines eventually learn to replicate or even surpass? Nobody watching this video right now knows the answer to that question with certainty, and frankly, nobody on Earth does, including the researchers building these systems at the world's most advanced AI labs. But there's one more piece of documented Einstein history that adds a genuinely fascinating and slightly hopeful wrinkle to this entire discussion, and it's been deliberately saved for this exact moment. Einstein was not only a physicist, he was also, by his own account and by extensive historical documentation, a deeply spiritual person in a very particular, specific sense, not religious in any traditional or denominational way, but moved profoundly by what he repeatedly called cosmic religious feeling, an overwhelming sense of awe at the order, harmony, and mystery underlying the universe. He wrote about this extensively. He described scientific discovery itself as a quasi-spiritual act, an attempt to glimpse the mind of God not through prayer or scripture, but through the elegant mathematical structure underlying physical reality. This matters enormously for our final analysis, because it points towards something AI systems, by their very technical nature, fundamentally cannot replicate, at least not based on how they currently work. An AI language model has no subjective experience of awe. It has no felt sense of wonder when it correctly predicts a protein structure or solves a complex equation. It is, however sophisticated, a system processing patterns in data, without anything resembling the inner, emotional, and almost spiritual dimension that drove Einstein's relationship with science throughout his entire life. He wasn't just solving equations. He was, by his own repeated description, having something that felt to him like a profound, almost religious encounter with the order of reality. Current AI architecture, brilliant as it is at producing outputs, has no documented or scientifically established equivalent inner experience whatsoever, and many AI researchers and philosophers of mind argue it may never develop one, regardless of how sophisticated its outputs eventually become, though this remains a genuinely contested and unresolved philosophical debate, not settled scientific fact. So perhaps, and this is offered honestly as speculation, not certainty, the most likely Einstein reaction to AI wouldn't be fear, and it wouldn't be blind enthusiasm either. It might be something closer to a specific kind of intellectual loneliness, watching machines convincingly simulate the outputs of human creativity and reasoning, while suspecting, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, that something essential, the felt experience of wonder itself, the spark that made him chase a beam of light as a teenager, remained entirely, stubbornly absent from the machine, no matter how impressive its calculations became. Let's bring this entire investigation to its conclusion, because it's time to gather every thread explored across this hour into something coherent, honest, and genuinely thought-provoking. What would Einstein think about artificial intelligence? Based on his extensively documented values, his historical track record of skepticism toward concentrated and unaccountable power, his deep and repeatedly stated belief in imagination as humanity's most precious cognitive resource, his hard-won, regret-filled experience watching a beautiful piece of physics get weaponized into something capable of mass destruction, and his profound, almost spiritual sense of wonder at the universe's underlying order, the most intellectually honest answer is neither simple admiration nor simple fear. It will likely have been something more textured and more useful than either extreme, a demand for transparency and accountability over who controls these increasingly powerful systems, echoing his reel. Documented activism, after witnessing nuclear weapons, escaped the careful intentions of their original creators. A concern, grounded in his own repeatedly stated educational philosophy, about a generation potentially trading independent thought for convenient algorithmic answers. And underneath both of these, a genuine, very Einstein-like fascination with watching humanity build a mirror that reflects back, with startling and sometimes unsettling fidelity, just how much of human intelligence can be reduced to pattern, statistics, and probability, while simultaneously revealing, by sheer contrast and absence, exactly how much of what makes a mind like Einstein's truly remarkable might still lie somewhere else entirely, in the felt experience of curiosity itself, not merely in its visible, reproducible outputs. Would Einstein have hated AI? Almost certainly not. Not in any simple sense that fits neatly into a video title. But there's strong, well-documented historical reason to believe he would have demanded humanity ask harder, more uncomfortable questions about it than most of the world is currently asking: who controls it, what it does to our capacity to imagine, and whether, in our rush to build machines that think, we remember to keep asking the kind of questions that, as far as we currently know, only a human being has ever been able to ask first. So here's the question this video leaves you with, the one worth sitting with long after the screen goes dark. If imagination, not knowledge, was the quality Einstein considered most precious and most irreplaceable about the human mind, what are you personally doing today in your own life to protect and exercise that exact quality in a world increasingly engineered to hand you fast, convenient, statistically optimized answers before you even finish forming the question yourself? Leave your answer in the comments. Because the most Einstein thing any of us can do right now isn't to debate what a dead genius might have thought about a technology he never lived to see. It's to actually use our own imagination today, while we still clearly, unambiguously can.